Hello everybody and welcome to Nathan on Shuffle and to my latest episode here on the channel. I'm really excited about this. We've got a big year-end special here. This is my year-end new music shuffle show where I talk about several albums throughout the year that I just missed or didn't review yet for whatever reason, or have come out fairly recently that I feel like are worth mentioning, are worth recommending. So this is a really solid list of albums, ones that I really recommend you guys check out. I'm going to put a list of the albums in the description along with a link to a Spotify playlist that will have tracks from each of these albums that you guys can check out, and I'm really excited for talking through these albums. I'm going to try to do each album review in like under a minute just to try to give a quick impression, because I know it's a lot to get through and I don't think most of you will want to sit through a huge epic long video. So I just want to give an impression of the album, if it's worth checking out, if you like certain styles of music, and put your attention to the description to check out tracks on my playlist. So that should be really fun. So hopefully you guys will enjoy this format. I'm just doing it in an alphabetical order by artist, so there's no preference, there's no order here, it's just by artist alphabetically. So hopefully you guys enjoy that format. I'm going to try to keep it really tight. I'm keeping my eyes on a timer here so that I keep the reviews really under the time limit and give just a very basic overview. So hopefully you guys appreciate that, and let's jump into it. Let's get into this. So first album I have on my list is Banco del Mutuo Soccorso, and the album Orlando Le Forme Dell'Amore. This is rock progressivo Italiano from Italy, a legendary band that's been in the game since 1969, coming out with a really cool concept album. They released an album in 2019, which was somewhat of a comeback album for them, called Trans-Siberiana, but this one's even better. This one's really exciting. It's a really lengthy album, so there's a lot to it, but there's really some cool acoustic sections, there's some cool proggy bits, parts of it even sound like a proggy tango. There's jazzy feels to some of the music here, a little bit of a gentle giant quirkiness, some great instrumental moments, but also some beautiful singing. It feels very much Italian in its nature and just has a really cool spirit to it, and I really enjoyed this album quite a bit. Really cool, with a lot of different variety on display. The next album I want to talk about is Civilians and their self-titled album. This is a 6-piece from Brooklyn. They blend a lot of interesting styles together: hard rock, jazz, electronic, funk, music in different ways. There's psychedelia, there's horn sections, grooviness. You know, I believe they have some shared members in common from Thank You Scientist. That's basically how I heard about the band, is that Thank You Scientist was recommending it because they have some shared members on the horns, because Thank You Scientist also has this funky, cool horn section as well. But what I like about the album is that it has a lot of cool jazzy instrumental moments that you might expect from a band with a big horn section, but they also have this almost dreamy pop sensibility in some of their tracks. You know, Gwendolyn is more of an epic horn opening like Chicago, almost a Zappa-esque vibe to it, but then something like Mildew is a bit more dreamy pop that's just accentuated by that great brass. Next we have Comedy of Errors and their album Time Machine. This is Neo-Prog from the UK. A lot of you probably know of this band and of this album. It's a really familiar one for big prog heads like me. It has a bit of a medieval or Regency style sound to it that harkens back to stuff that I really like from like Gentle Giant or early Renaissance or things like that really delve into this classical Renaissance style flair, but it has a lot of some more modern tendency as well, some 80s style stuff in that mix as well. I think the first track has a really 80s neo-prog flavor, but I really like some of that Regency prog style as well that comes up in future sections of different stuff. There's even little nods and odes to other musical works, like in Lost Demigods, there's Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and Ode to Joy. Next we have the band Compass and their album Theory of Tides. This is a progressive metal album from the UK, a pleasing blend of prog metal, a la something like Dream Theater, Fate's Warning, heavier Rush as well, is more into this, but also makes with a more of an AOR sensibility like Toto, Styx, Journey, something like that. So if you can kind of mix that in your head of some lighter melodic progressive metal, but also this AOR or 80s style sound. I think you've got a pretty good idea of what Compass is doing here. Mountains on the Moon is a great opener with a piano intro and symphonic orchestration before a metallic riff enters the fray. Really evokes the power of prog metal through the drums and guitar, but the keys and vocals really bring that 80s AOR flavor. And it just continues with that sort of vein. Searching for Answers has a cool synth opening and a very melodic hard rock feel. Next on the list is Deaton LeMay Project and their album The Fifth Element. This is Neo-Prog from the US, and really the big headline of the band for me is that they sound a lot like ELP. There's a lot of leanings, especially in the keyboard playing, that are really heavy into that ELP flavor. I'm also reminded a bit of Evership, which released an album this year, in the vocals especially, and then the 70s rock influences throughout the album. There's a lot of influence from bands like Kansas, Styx, Yes even, in their music. So you hear a bit of that. Some great classic rock stylings. Keith Emerson's influences all over the place on this. I really like A Different Place in Time is a great track. Strong Keith Emerson influence, shifting a bit to give way to a beautiful piano acoustic guitar with keyboard synths over top. Dragonfly is a beautiful solo piano piece that's very classically inspired. Next on my list is Dreadnought with their album The Endless. This is eclectic prog from the US. It can be a bit heavy at times, so fair warning if you're not into the heaviness. They have basically two vocalists, one that's more of a clean female vocals, and then one that's the harsher, more screaming style vocals, so you get the two sides of the coin there. But when it's lighter and you get more of the clean vocal sections is the stuff that stands out for me, at least. You get some post-rock, almost folk sounds in this, but balanced with some heavy death metal and jazz as well. It's just very eclectic, that's why it's titled as eclectic prog, because there's a lot of stuff in the stew here that they're doing that's really, really interesting. World's Break is the opener that starts with a slow build and those ethereal female vocals, not unlike Mariana Simkina of I Am the Morning, but things get more intense with a big wall of sound and harsher screaming vocals. And you get some wonderful drums and bass with arpeggiated guitar lines and more of that clean vocals returning. So that gives a flavor for what you can expect throughout the album. Next, a big one that I haven't talked about yet. If it hadn't come out so late in the year, I probably would have given it its due in its own separate review. This is the band Elder and their album Innate Passage. Heavy prog from the US, wonderful blend of like sludgy metal, think of like Mastodon, with some really cool proggy psychedelic touches. I think this is their strongest album. They're a band I've been following and aware of for quite some time. They're a little bit jam bandy in some ways. They do a lot of these extended instrumental sections. They can go into these almost hypnotic repeating sections, almost atmospheric a little bit, but then they can get into some heavier crunchy stuff as well. But I think this album does a really great job of incorporating some proggy elements into their typical, more psychedelic jamming. You get that sludgy metal opening, but some great synths come on top of it on 2 minutes in to the opening track, Esthesis. Some great, nice, clean guitar tones, and we get some vocals in there. We get a killer guitar riff moving into a psychedelic, almost dreamlike soundscape. Some great harmony vocals as well in this track. That opening is one of my favorite tracks for this year. I just really love how it develops, and then you get more of that as the album continues. Next, we have a band called Esthesis and Watching Worlds Collide. This is Neo-Prog from France. Really cool album that I wish I'd paid more attention to earlier in the year. It takes a bit of a Pink Floyd style atmosphere, a dash of later Porcupine Tree style heaviness, and then a layer of jazz on top of that to give it a unique soundscape. Really great sound, incredible musicianship. Amber is a mid-tempo opener with a haunting vibe, some jazzy vibe in the musical soundscape, especially in the keys, but then it can move into that heavier vibe. Feels not too far removed from Porcupine Tree. A cinematic vibe adds to this feel with simulated strings, flute and sax perhaps in that mix as well. Place Your Bets is an incredible track with a laid-back bluesy style vein with some bluesy guitar licks. Bit of a Pink Floyd atmosphere here with some jazzy saxophone in the middle. Really cool stuff just all the way through. Next is Gandalf's Fist and the album Widdershins. This is Neo-Prog from the UK, a really solid Neo-Prog album that came out fairly recently. Delves a little bit into some harder rock and some folk, but has a lot of drama and flair, focusing on storytelling. That's what they're known for. They do these fairly elaborate concept albums typically, I think, or at least on their last several albums. Reminds me almost even of Trans-Siberian Orchestra with the drama and expressive vocals that they put on display and their more conceptual nature. But it's a really cool album with some really rocking songs. Sacrament starts with some organ and soaring vocals in a vein of like Deep Purple even in some ways. Widdershins starts softly with pretty piano and female vocals, and then continues with an almost folky flavor. Dreamcatcher is very dreamy, accurate to its name, with some atmospheric keys and acoustic guitar, building to an almost Gilmour-esque guitar solo. Next we have Guranfoe and their album Gumbo. This is eclectic prog from the UK. Instrumental songs as well. This is blending a bit of psychedelia with some prog intricacy as well. It takes you on a really cool proggy journey and ride. Reminds me a little bit of maybe the Canterbury type scene as well. Just a really pleasant, atmospheric feel through the countryside. It's just takes you on a bit of a wandering journey. Maybe there aren't really some great hooks to dive into and that are very memorable a lot of the time, but when you listen to it, it just has a really cool flavor to it, and it's just an enjoyable listen for people that like cool instrumental prog that has a bit of ties to like wobbler in ways to me, bit of that folky style flavor to it. The next album I wanted to mention is Hallas and the album Isle of Wisdom. This is crossover prog from Sweden. A really good, just classic retro sounding hard rock with some proggy leanings. The songs gallop along at a good meaty crunch. I think it's a blend of like early Black Sabbath type stuff, but with some more proggy Yes-like tendencies in sections. Maybe like a more hard rocking, less proggy wobbler is what I was thinking when listening to this. Just talking about the wobbler influence on the previous, but I hear it here as well. Maybe tinges of Blue Oyster Cult or Iron Maiden or something like that, especially in their opener, Birth / Into Darkness. Advent of Dawn continues in the same vein, keeping up that same heavy energy, but adding more breathing room for some light, almost jazzy interludes. Maybe a Canterbury flavor. Lucian's Gate is a fun, shorter rocker with some great organ work, which brings to mind almost a Deep Purple style influence. And The Wind Carries the Word is a great final track that takes a lot of different paths, some hard rocking elements, some laid back grooves. A really rousing conclusion to a really solid album. The next one is Inhalo and Sever, some modern alternative prog from the Netherlands. This is one I just stumbled across very recently, even though I believe it came out several months ago. Incredible debut record from a young band that sounds very modern, fresh and vibrant. You get a bit of a heavier sound here, bringing to mind some more alternative modern prog metal bands like Tesseract or Carnival, even Haken and Riverside a little bit. One of the big influences in my mind is Tool. I think they have a big Tool influence that you can hear throughout the drumming and the bass playing. It has that darker, moodier atmosphere that Tool is known for. The album's bookended by these two shorter piano-driven pieces that bring an atmospheric feel before you get these heavier tracks that are in the middle. And it's just overall sounds really pristine, and it's just a really solid modern alternative prog band that I think has a lot of promise and maybe got overlooked. I didn't hear about them till today when I'm filming this practically. So a really cool album that I think many would like. Next we have a band called Karcius and the album Gray, White, Silver, Yellow, and Gold. This is categorized as jazz rock fusion from Canada. I didn't really hear a ton of the jazz rock fusion. This is just the description it's given in Prog Archives. Much more heavy prog in my mind, more in the vein of some of the more metallic sides of Porcupine Tree, like the In Absentia Deadwing era. perhaps. Parasite is the opening track that gives a pretty heavy opening before we get to the vocals. Some good crunchy guitar riffs, heavy prog with an almost heavy metal sounding vocalist. Supernova opens with acoustic guitar, piano, and more delicate vocals. Nice change of pace, but increases in heaviness as it goes along. Really cool, varied record. Blends the line between that heavier Porcupine Tree era, some atmospheric Pink Floyd stuff, and some jazzy undertones throughout. I think they've evolved into this heavier sound and used to have more of that jazz rock vibe, but here they're more into that heavier style, and it works really well. So really great album. The next album is from King Buffalo, and it's their album Regenerator. Heavy psych is basically how I'd characterize this from the US. Really does a great job blending old school psychedelia and hard rock, but bringing it into a more modern era. Sometimes this album didn't grab me immediately because I feel like the approach can feel a bit samey and repetitive. They really get into this hypnotic, repeating groove over and over. But I can't deny that it has such great musicianship, and that really builds a really cool, great atmosphere as well. They're just great musicians, this group. They're a group from Rochester, New York, blend a lot of these psychedelic soundscapes with a more wall of sound approach. This album in particular has a bit of a brightness and warmth to it, in contrast to some of their earlier works that I think makes this a good starting point for people trying to get into the band. And continuing on in that similar vein, another jam band that's well known in the prog parts. This is King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, and their album Changes. This is the album I decided to focus on. They actually released like 5 albums this year, the other ones being Made in Timeland, Omnium Gatherum, Ice, Death, Planets, Lungs, Mushrooms, and Lava, and Laminated Denim. In another world, I was considering just each one of those getting their own section in this, but I decided to focus on Changes because to me that was the best release of those group for me personally. They shift genres a lot. They do tons of different albums with different styles, but this album in particular really delves into this psychedelic garage and acid rock style. There's almost a jazziness. They're infusing a little bit of this R&B and pop stylings into their music. It begins with the song Change, which is a really cool extended piece that really showcases this feel. And so it's just a really cool little record that showcases their tendencies as a jam band and shows them as artists, really expanding their style. So next we get into Gleb Kolyadin and the release The Outland. This is crossover prog from Russia, very much classical inspiration here. Gleb is one half of the I Am the Morning duo. Mariana Simkina is the other half, but she's not on this record. It's a purely instrumental record, very much diving into his classical pianist background. I love his solo work. He has a solo self-titled record that I really loved before this one. He brings Gavin Harrison on drums for the album, which is a really cool addition to the soundscape, and it just glides along with this mixture of jazzy and classical playing that I think is really fun with this Gavin Harrison drumming over top. Piano playing is just totally flawless through this, but we also get some orchestral elements. There's some upright bass, there's some string instruments, some flute and other things. So you get a really cool blend of these other classical influences in the playing. Next is a band called Lighthouse Sparrows and their album Aerials. This is Neo-Prog from Finland. Not super proggy here compared to a lot of the other stuff on the list. More of prog touchstones amongst some melancholy art rock, but there's a dark moodiness to this album in the soundscape and the vocals. There's some Pink Floyd comparisons in the laid-back approach of the pace of the songs, as well as some expressive David Gilmour style guitar playing. But you don't expect big progressive rock fireworks on this album. It's more about the atmosphere, building a feel, and having some of those Pink Floyd style inspirations, maybe some sophisticated art pop, not unlike Tears for Fears. But it just continues there with some bluesy guitar, some darker vibes in the vocals, Gilmour-esque style guitars, and it's a really cool, beautiful little album. Next we have a band called Magician's Red and their album Threshold. This is symphonic prog from Finland, a really promising debut from a band that definitely showcases their 70s prog influence but adds their own modern flair, creating a very accessible brand of symphonic prog. Dark Flow Part 1 opens the album with some jazzy harmonic guitar lines with some expressive synths. Great symphonic prog opening before we get into a jazzier feel with the vocals and a great groove. Then Dark Flow Part 2 begins with more expressive synth work, almost a 80s inspiration. Upside Down, Inside Out features some fantastic Beach Boys-esque harmonies also, with a little bit almost of a later Beatles period style. Some great jazziness, Canterbury flavor at times as well. Crossing the Threshold has more symphonic prog bombast with some jazzy leanings, really tastefully done, and closes with Dark Flow Song Cycle Part 3 on a virtuoso guitar solo. So just a really solid new album from a promising band if you like your 70s flavored symphonic prog. This is fitting that bill for me really well. Next, I wanted to mention Major Parkinson and their album Valisa Chapter 1 Velvet Prison. This is eclectic prog from Norway. This is a band that's always been right on the tip of my radar that I haven't really delved too deep into. I know they're very experimental, very different, and have a cool vibe and sound to them. But I really delved into this album in particular, which has a big synth pop flavor to it, very much 80s style synth pop, only little touchstones of prog in the mix, but really pleasing sounds and really great melodies. The main singer has a very deep voice with tons of character and emotion. There's also female vocals that pop around throughout the album as well. I believe it's a guest who's singing a lot of those female vocals that's not typically with the band, but it really delves into some new wave pop, some 80s synth styles, like on Saturday Night, for example. It's just a really eclectic, interesting album. There's a lot of these little short interludes throughout the album, so the main tracks are hidden a little bit between all of these different 1-minute little sections, but it provides for an interesting pace to the album, and I think it's well worth checking out if you like something a little bit different with some pop inspirations, some of that 80s synth style, and it's a really cool little album. Next, we have David Maximikic with Bilo 4. This is progressive metal from Serbia. I've heard a lot of people speak very highly of David Maximikic and his discography up to this point. Just a really great, expressive guitarist who plays a lot of really cool guitar lines that are very unique and interesting. There's a lot on this record. There's some great guitar playing, obviously, but there's an interesting blend of like prog metal, cinematic soundscapes, and some almost jazzy flourishes throughout the album. But his sound is very unique and very personal to him, and I think that's part of his strength, is that he plays this very fluid style progressive metal that's unlike anything else you hear, and I think he's bringing that Serbian influence and a bit of world music vibes to the table here. Very creative and very fresh. He's excellent at painting pictures with music. It's really varied and interesting. It goes through a lot of different stuff, but just contains so much beautiful music. Just a highly recommended album that if I gave much more attention to might creep up into my list of favorites for the year. So definitely check that one out. Next, I want to briefly touch on the Mommy Heads and the album Genius Killer. This is essentially power pop from the US, Brooklyn-based band. Great power pop record in the style of something like Jellyfish, ELO, the Beatles, Queen, XTC. You got a lot of that flavor here. Not very proggy, but I think a lot of people that like prog tend to like this kind of thing as well. Just very upbeat and evoking those classic styles like that 60s, 70s style rock. And so it's just really catchy and fun, but a little bit of a modern flair. Think of a band like Supergrass as well to compare them to. So you get a lot of variety and a lot of interesting things here. And so I wanted to mention that as interesting one to check out if you like the Jellyfish style power pop type stuff that a lot of prog guys tend to gravitate towards, in my experience at least. Next, I want to touch on Oceans of Slumber and their album Starlight and Ash. This is tech extreme prog metal from the US. I believe they've been morphing a little bit in their sound to this more gothic metal style that isn't quite as technical and heavy as maybe they were known for before, but this brings a lot of southern flair, a lot of southern feel to the music and style, this almost southern rock. You can really hear their roots from southern Texas, almost that country style flair and vibe. Not like there's country style twang, but more of this classic rock and blues of a southern variety that I think really adds to their metal sound, and you get the incredible vocals from Cami that are just really next level. That's really the focus to me of the album, is her vocal stylings, And there's just some really cool tracks here that really showcase that almost swampy New Orleans style southern vibe that I think brings a lot of cool flavor to their mixture. Next I have a band called Raise the Maze and the album 7 AM Dream. This is crossover prog from the US. They used to be a group called Motar, but that group split up and some of their members created this Raise the Maze group, blending a bit of chamber pop, avant prog, and some really cool, quirky, angular attitude to their music. There's some female vocals here that are really expressive and fun, bringing some of an off-kilter style to them. And it continues in that vein with that quirky, off-kilter Zappa vibe. Some great female vocals, some jazzy leanings, and just some pop sensibilities, making a really fascinating stew and mixture of sounds. And I just really thought this was a cool record and wanted to point that one out. Next we have Regal Worm and the album Worm. This is crossover prog from the UK, a strange mixture of psychedelia and electronica, little hints of Canterbury and jazz also. The vocals are very processed and almost robotic sounding, but it gives for a very interesting vibe, definitely almost a space rock vibe, especially in Don't Freak Out the Creatures. Showing some of those jazzy tendencies as well and some crazy wild percussion. Have a lot of cool variety on display here, a little bit of touchstones of that electronica, some psychedelia, some Canterbury, some jazz, and almost some folk flavors as well, creating a very interesting stew of different things in the mixture. So Silent Skies and the album Nectar is next. This is the combination of the soulful vocals of Evergrey's Thomas England and the brilliant keys of Vikram Shankar of Lux Terminus, and this is a great pairing between these two. It's really virtuosic keyboard playing with England's really expressive vocal styling, making a very emotional ballad-heavy album with cinematic production, brilliant piano takes, bringing some electronic touches as well, and a gorgeous cello, really adding a great layer of melancholy and sound to this. Beautiful piano and vocals, great atmosphere and electronica, cinematic feel, gorgeous melodies, almost feels like it could work as a good cozy winter album to curl up with and listen to. Just some of the beautiful melodies on board, so definitely a really cool album that I wanted to highlight. Next I have The Smile and their album A Light for Attracting Attention. This is an album from a group featuring some of the members of Radiohead, Tom York and Johnny Greenwood, and also drummer Tom Skinner of the London jazz quartet Sons of Kemet. Obviously, there's shades of Radiohead sound in this album. Balances soundtrack composer Greenwood's interest in contemporary classical music with Philip Glass-like minimalist piano motifs, as well as hints of complex King Crimson guitar lines, jazzy brass arrangements similar to David Bowie's Black Star, and some krautrock influences as well, or rhythms from Tom Skinner, who plays in a bit of a jazzy style in a lot of this way. So for me, it's very much in that indie alternative style like Radiohead is known for. A bit of a jazzy undertone, especially in the drumming, and gives an interesting, unique stamp on that sound with some interesting layers and some darker themes built into the music. Next, we have Sweet Billy Pilgrim and the album Samopolis. Sweet Billy Pilgrim is a duo comprising of multi-instrumentalist Jana Carpenter and Tim Elsenberg. Great fun art rock and pop with a bit of an 80s flavor to be heard here. I think it's really pleasing to the ears. They have great vocals, great blend of male and female vocals that blend together on the track We Are the Bright Carvers. Bliss Maps has a fantastic funky bass line, some electronica elements also. Added trumpet and sax almost give this a spaghetti western vibe. Atticus Atlas has some funky 70s bass with fabulous female vocals, some great dreamy keyboards as well. Really cool throwback style and sound. Down I Go strips back to just a waltzy piano and vocals before more ambient keyboard textures add layers to the sound. The Night Watch has a sleek 70s funk vibe, almost like something like Steely Dan perhaps. Get Back to Where You Started has big 80s vibes with a big catchy chorus and some brass highlights. Just really cool art rock and pop with an 80s flavor. Little blends of progressive elements into the mix, but just beautiful music with a folky vibe and just really, really well done. Next we have Vast Conduit. Always Be There is the name of the album. This is Neo-Prog from the US. alternates between some really strong Neo-Prog songs with vocals and some sprightly jazz fusion instrumental workouts. Some of these instrumental songs remind me of something like Dixie Dregs might do with their more jazz fusion leanings. But it's a really solid album with some really cool tracks. Barrier is a good opening, expressing the band's Neo-Prog style, but a bit of a jazzy influence with some great piano and jazzy bass lines and even some violin into that mix. Soul Tuck is a great instrumental track with a jazz fusion vibe. Endless Days has some wonderful keys and colorful bass with a great vocal, bit of a ballad flavor leading to a great solo instrumental feature with expressive guitar. Philly Etymology adds some trumpet into the jazz sounds as well. 500 Miles is a straightforward rock track with some jazz influenced keys. So this album is just really strong with some jazz fusion leanings, but also some great Neo-Prog stylings. And if you like the combination of those factors, I think this is a solid one to check out. Another one more recent on my radar is Verbal Delirium and their album Conundrum. This is crossover prog from Greece, and this is just a really beautiful, fun album to listen to with some really interesting flavors as well. You get a starker cinematic style through a lot of the record and an expressive vocalist with lots of quirkiness that contain hallmarks of groups like XTC, Queen, maybe even a little bit of Gentle Giant in the mix there. And it really creates a fascinating blend that's just super fun to listen through. You start off with a big cinematic dark opening with Falling before getting into a more power pop influenced track called In Pieces, inspired partly by XTC and Queen, leading to some Freddie Mercury-esque harmonies and culminating in some dark orchestral moments towards the end with choir. Intruder starts with hand claps that almost made me think of Just the Same by Gentle Giant before we get to a bubbly keyboard melody and almost some Beach Boys inspired harmonies in the mix as well. Conundrum is an all-out instrumental workout with some Balkan rock influence, clarinet and sax in the mix, some organ adding some old school flavor, definitely has folk and jazz vibes in it, and it just continues from there with some really cool, interesting things. This is highly recommended. This is an incredible album, really cool vibes to it, and I think the band really hit it out of the park with some really cool sections, so definitely check that one out. Another really strong release from this year that I probably should have paid more attention to is Versa and the album A Voyage / A Destination. This is post-rock, prog rock hybrid from Canada. It starts with this really expansive epic. It kind of is bookended by these two big epic pieces. Pull of the Naiads, which is a fantastic work of art. This is probably the highlight of the album for me, is this opening track. Eric Gillette is guesting on vocals here, and his voice sounds beautiful. And it's a really great blend between this more lighter post-rock feel with violin and flutes, but then also a heavier rocking prog section with some Hammond organ. There's even a folk flavor that makes me think back to like Jethro Tull. I even think about Big Big Train with the fairly epic conclusion here that adds some trumpet and choir vocals. So really hits all the marks of all these great influences that I love and enjoy. Then there's two shorter, more instrumental songs sandwiched between. Voyage is the final track, which is another big proggy epic that has a lot of slow, atmospheric, hypnotic builds. Jim Gray and Mariana Simkina are doing vocals here, and they're excellent. Nick DiVirgilio has some great percussion on this track. It's just really cool. Maybe it plays out a bit longer than I would have liked at the end, but when it hits, it really hits well. It's just a fantastic piece with some beautiful sections. And that's the album overall. It's just a beautiful record. Definitely highly recommended. I really loved this and would recommend it heartily. Next, we have something a little bit different, not really in the prog mold. This is Wise Blood and In the Darkness, Hearts Aglow. More orchestral pop, very 70s inspired. You can hear a lot of Karen Carpenter in the vocals from Natalie Meering. This is incredible, beautiful music that I just had to focus. This got squeezed in at the last minute, but I've been loving it so much I had to mention it on the channel in some fashion because it's just such a beautiful record that brings back that California style, late 60s sound, maybe like the Beach Boys circa Pet Sounds era, is what you can hear in the arrangements and in the background. And like I said, her vocals really are reminiscent of Karen Carpenter, which is one of my favorite vocalists. She just has this really rich character to her voice, and it's just a gorgeous, lush, music. It's not just me, it's everybody. It's just this really lush opening with beautiful orchestration in the background. Children of the Empire is probably my favorite track on the album. Just keeps that lush orchestral feel, but adds a bit of an upbeat 70s poppy style to it with some excellent harmonies. Just a beautiful, beautiful record if you just like beautiful 70s orchestral pop and some excellent, beautiful singing. It's really top-notch music that needs to be heard and should be wildly popular and on the radio. And the last album I want to talk about is from the band Why Not, and the album is called Light and Shade. This is heavy prog from the US. Obviously very Rush-inspired just from the name Why Not, which is obviously a nod to YYZ or YYZ, depending on where you're from. And it begins with a really cool instrumental Rush-inspired track called Wire and Wood, which shows their chops, shows that they have a really great feel for this Rush-inspired instrumental sound. But then it goes off into more of a poppier direction, a pop rock style with almost a country flavor with some interesting catchy female vocals. So it's really interesting to hear that juxtaposition where you get this hard rock with prog leanings, definite Rush inspiration, but a very poppy mainstream female vocalist. I'm not sure it always works throughout the album, but it is an interesting listen that I think is worth checking out and worth giving your time to. If for nothing else, listen to Wire and Wood, the opening track, for a really cool Rush-inspired instrumental. That's basically what you have on display here is really cool instrumental stuff in the makes with some interesting poppier female vocals over top that may or may not be to your taste, but is a really interesting blend and I think is worth exploring. So those are the albums that I have for you guys. It's probably a bit longer of a show than I wanted it to be. It's hard to just pare down my discussions of these albums into a minute, but I had a lot of fun here talking about these albums. Hopefully you'll enjoy these recommendations and have a lot of cool albums to go check out now. And really, that's all I have for you guys. It's a long enough show, so thank you guys for joining me. Let me know in the comments any albums that I may have missed here that you wish were featured or that you think need more attention. And remember, my big album shows are coming with my actual favorites of the year, so this isn't my top list. This is just notable, good albums that I thought were worth recommending. So thank you guys so much for joining me. Keep enjoying the music out there, and I'll catch you guys in another video. Thank you. Bye.